300 years of one of the greatest civilizations or the greatest dynasties in history ended in an act of murder, the assassination of a child who is exactly 7 years and 1 month old. The child emperor and the parent die in the waters. That's the end of the glorious Song dynasty. Finished.
Because the part in your book about the conquering of the Song dynasty is probably my favorite part of the book. Like, it's fascinating how they did that, because he had to basically turn like a Mongol type empire and like transform their whole mindset about the waters and the way of warfare, etc.
Yes, yes.
But before we get into that, like, how did he conquer them? Could you help us understand, like, how powerful was the Song dynasty and why was it so hard to conquer them in the first place?
The Song dynasty is one of the greatest dynasties of Chinese history. In almost every regard, with their technology, with their literature, with their art, with everything about it. But like every dynasty in the world or every civilization, it decays over time. And they had been in power altogether for about 300 years. And they ruled China, but there were three waves of people coming from the north pushing them south. The first were people called the Khitan, who were sort of cousins, we might say, to the Mongols. And they had created they created the Liao dynasty. They were replaced by the Jin dynasty, which was the Jushid people of Manchuria, and they pushed the Song farther south. And uh, the Song, at first, of course, in the far north, they had a few little mud walls, nothing like the Great Wall we think of today. Just some mud walls and some big ditches. They were good at building big ditches. Well, that didn't stop the nomads. It didn't stop any of the people from the north. So they kept going farther south, and then they changed their tactic. Instead of having mud walls and ditches, they would have a great green wall. And that was, they would plant a huge area of 100 kilometers or more with trees and make it into a forest. And they would fill it with ponds along the way and little channels and rivers and irrigation ditches in order to stop. Well, it was an excellent system. It was natural. It was renewing itself. It kept, because the northern horsemen, to get through a forest with them is very difficult. And you have a forest that's riddled with streams and ponds and little rivers. That's even more difficult. So the Great Green Wall was extremely effective, but it's also extremely tempting to other South Song people because now you've got these great massive trees growing. Oh, there's timber to be had. It's filled with animals, all kinds of animals living out there that you can hunt, and feathers and furs and all kinds of exotic medicines and waterfowl in the little ponds and lakes and lots of fish. And they kept encroaching on it till finally there was no green wall left. So by 1127, then the Jin, the Justit people, the Jin of North, they had pushed the Song all the way to the south, south of the Yangtze, basically. And so then after that, history calls them the South Song or the Southern Song. They're more longer just a song. So this is what the Mongols were facing. They came in, they first had to defeat the Jin. Well, they did that. It wasn't overly difficult. The interesting thing about that is that the Jin capital, which is now Beijing, the Jin capital was conquered in the year 1215 by Genghis Khan. But that's a year that Kublai Khan was born. He was born in September that year. So he was born the year that they conquered the northern part of the Jin. But it's taken years and years and years to keep pushing back. And finally, to conquer the Jin completely took until the time of Gudei Han, after Genghis Khan's death. And then they only faced the South Song. But that was the greatest empire in the world, you could say. It was the most powerful, the most technologically sophisticated. It produced the most stuff. It's just amazing amounts of stuff that they could produce for world trade. And this became then the obsession, the inherited obsession of the Mongol Khans. And it was Kublai Khan who's the one who finally succeeded.
And like, what were the main difficulties that Kublai um, ran up against with trying to invade that part of the Chinese Empire?
Water. It was water.
Mm.
The Yangtze River is this huge, almost like a flowing ocean. It's so big and wide. This giant river there. And then, of course, the coastline itself. All of this was the protection. And the Song had the Great Green Wall, which was trees mostly. And then now they had what they call the Great Wall of the Sea or the Great Water Wall. They would be protected by that. And it was a very good, once again, a good policy. And they built a navy to protect themselves, a coastal navy, and also a navy for a riverine navy on the Yangtze River, and some ancillary rivers also, tributaries. So they had a very good protection. This was the great problem that Kublai Khan had to face. How to conquer this great wall of water. And he was really struggling with that. Their first response was, okay, we'll go far, far, far to the west to where the rivers are very small, and we will conquer over there, and then we will come in from the west on the other side. But even that proved difficult. And so they were up in some of the northern cities, and then we have a young general named Aju, whose father had been an earlier general Urihankadai, and whose grandfather was the greatest conqueror in history, I would say. That was Subadai. Subadai was the great strategist for Genghis Khan. So Aju is the grandson of this great strategist. And earlier, back in the time of Monghan, Aju had been with his father, Urihankadai, in the invasion of North Vietnam. At that time, they were following this strategy. We're going to go around the Song dynasty. We're going to conquer the far west. We're going to conquer the south, and then we're going to move in. And we don't have to cross the Yangtze River. We're going to avoid that. Well, he came down the Red River in northern Vietnam against, it was a Dai Viet Empire. And they were reasonably successful. They came in from Yunnan province, so far from the west, the northwest. They came down and they met the army of the Dai Viet Emperor at the Red River. Well, the two armies faced each other across the river. The Dai Viet had come up mostly on boats, but they had a large contingent of elephants. The other side, you have the Mongols and their horses, which are not doing so well in this Mongolian climate and without grass lands, open pastures, and they're not so great. But Urihankadai figured out, okay, what we have to do is, for the elephants, they already knew from Burma, we attack the feet with fire. That will panic the elephants. But then the men will probably flee to their boats. And so we've got to send out a detachment of people to burn the boats first before we attack. Well, that was the great plan. So Urihankadai had a good plan. He explained it to the officers. They went out there. But Mongols don't always follow the plan, and they want to get into action. And the idea of going to burn boats, wait, the fighting is over there. So the guys who were sent to burn the boats suddenly were in the middle of the battle. Well, the Mongols won the battle. The elephants routed in fear for the fire. But the North Vietnam soldiers just went back to their boats and sailed off back to what's today Hanoi, back to their capital. So he had won the battle, but he had lost. This is very common in Vietnamese history. You can win and still lose, But so they marched down the river towards Hanoi. But the Vietnamese took everything they could take out of Hanoi, all the food, everything, and they fled off into the marshlands of the Great Delta area of the Red River. So Aju had seen all this. He was with his father. He understood the importance of water. He understood the importance of boats. This is the most important thing of all. The Mongols lost that expedition. They had to return to China. They had failed to conquer North Vietnam. So much later, get to the time of Kublai Khan. It's already now the 1270s when we're there with Kublai Khan, that we find that Aju is trying to think in a new way. And he is going up and down the rivers. He really explored the rivers to make sure he understood the craft that we use, to understood the little rivers, the big rivers, all of this. And he recognized something very important. Chinese cities were built with incredible fortification, and the Mongols could not break the fortification. But the fortification was extremely strong on the land side. On the water side, it was relatively weak. The walls were smaller, not well defended. They had not built great walls because they never expected anybody to attack them from the water. They only expected the Mongols to attack by land. So he thought, okay, how do we attack them by water? And the idea was, if we could get catapults loaded onto boats, or trebuchets, but are catapults, we could say, but trebuchets. But they didn't have actually the technology. China had very good catapults, but they didn't have exactly what he needed. And those would come from the Muslim countries of Central Asia, the Mongol Ilkhanate. So they asked Kublai Khan to send them some engineers from Central Asia, from Middle East, from Persia, and from Iraq. And they sent the engineers there, and the engineers, through trial and error, they were able to adapt these trebuchets, these catapults, to the boats. It's a very difficult thing to do because when the thing fires, it's going to be tremendous power. You have to keep the boat afloat and all. But they perfected it. They invaded the cities of the upper reaches of the Yangtze, and they broke through the walls faster than the people inside could repair the walls, and they conquered them. So Aju, through these excellent engineers who had helped him, he came up with a strategy, and they were able to make it happen, and he was beginning the conquest of southern Song, only beginning.
And what was the morale like of the soldiers during that battle? Because I can imagine, as you mentioned in your book, the Mongolian soldiers weren't fan of boats. They despised boats, you could nearly say. Would you say like the soldiers were mostly Chinese if they had to go on a boat, or was it Mongolians who were convinced eventually, or what did that look like?
Yes, the Mongolian attitude towards boats, the first time Kublai Khan came in and they had faced a river back in the campaign against Yunnan earlier, they had crossed on goat skins attached underneath rafts. Because the soldiers, the reason they didn't like boats was because in the Mongol culture on the steppe, of course there are no boats there because the rivers aren't big, but on the steppe, women owned the carts. Wooden carts are all owned by women, all managed by women, all driven by women. A man will not drive it. He's got to be unconscious before you can put him on a cart. But if he has to guide the cart, he will be on his horse and just guide it. He will not get in it. That's a very strict division. Well, a boat is a lot like a cart floating on the water. And that just wasn't manly. They would rather go over on a goat skin being pulled by the tail of their horse, because at least that's a manly thing. You've got your horse, you've got the goat skin. If you're doing a Mongol thing, you're not in a cart. So it was a big problem, but Aju himself helped to overcome that by he personally would go out in the boat, and sometimes he took command of the boat. He would help with the steering of the boat. He showed the man. I don't think he totally convinced them, but the fact that they were beginning to win certainly was convincing. All the technology for the boat was Chinese. We could say that the technology for the weapons was from the Ilkhanate, from Iraq and from Persia. But the boat itself was all, and the Mongols adapted to it. And I can't say they ever embraced it totally, emotionally, but they adapted. They saw the effectiveness of it, especially as long as you could have Chinese helping to operate the boats. Then you had these engineers helping to operate the catapults. They were willing to go along with it and have a horse somewhere close by.
Well, this channel is mostly about like studying people before you so you can kind of like implement that later in your life. And you also see that with this invasion, right? Because there was someone else, I don't remember the name, but he tried to invade the Song dynasty like 100 years before Kublai, correct?
Mm.
And like, what mistakes did he make which Kublai was able to not make
Yes,
because he studied?
yes, yes. Fortunately, Kublai Khan was fairly good with history and learning from the past. He was a little bit
Mm.
better than many of the others. And the Jin dynasty had also created a navy. They had also recognized in their campaign against the South Song earlier, they had recognized that the way is we have to have a navy in addition to an army. They did a miserable job of it. First, they got some boats, some river boats, and they lured a couple of engineers from the South Song. Uh, and see, craftspeople weren't well respected among the Han Chinese of South China. They respected Confucianist scholarships and calligraphy and music and everything else. But people who built things weren't so well respected. But in the north, the Jin and later the Mongols respected them more and paid them more. So they would defect. So anyway, the Jin built their own navy to attack. But it was a beautiful navy, a beautiful navy. And they made beautiful big red sails to go on these boats that were made along the river. And to make them just more beautiful, they coated them with oil so they just would glisten in the sun. And they would just go along and the waves would be flowing and the sun glistening. And oh, what a beautiful navy. So they sent it out. Well, first of all, they had no idea where they were going and they got lost. It was a river navy and not really appropriate for the ocean. When they saw the South Song fleet attacking, they didn't realize it was the South Song. They assumed it was their friends, so they didn't even prepare for battle. And when the South Song Navy came up, here are these bright red sails out there on the water, glistening in the sun, and they just started firing flaming arrows, which immediately set the sails on fire. And the Jin had packed the ship with soldiers. That's what they thought would win the war. Packed it with soldiers, heavily armed soldiers who were going to fight on the land. Well, they can hardly move around, and now this red oil and these cloth, these bamboo sails are falling on them. They're falling into the ocean. They're drowning. The fleet was wiped out. Wiped out. So the Jin had failed completely in their effort to break through the Great Wall of the Sea of the South Song. And Kublai Khan knew that, and he recognized they had to build different kinds of ships, ships that were appropriate for the sea. Don't put oil on the sails, and don't have red sails. These are simple little lessons, but they helped a lot.
Yeah. And eventually he beats the Song dynasty. Can you
Yes,
tell me something about how he handled the former emperor and his family? Because I found that very interesting.
yes. If I could add something before that, before
Yes,
he
of course.
defeated the South Song, he tried to invade China. I'm sorry, he tried to invade Japan from China, and he failed miserably in that one. So they hadn't yet worked out all the techniques. So I think that failure was extremely important to him in working out better tactics for the ocean. I think he'd
Mhm.
intended to show the South Song. He wanted them to surrender after they saw the surrender of Japan. Japan did not surrender. His fleet was destroyed. And the South Song court was just going on. First of all, they didn't even know that their cities were being lost up on the river because the generals were lying. They didn't want to be punished for losing. And so the court was down there in Hangzhou, and the court was going on as though everything's fine. We didn't even know we're losing this war. And then the Mongols have been defeated by Japan. By who? Japan? Oh, we don't have to worry about that Navy at all. So they're very complacent. But of course, the Mongols are advancing step by step by step. Mongols are persistent and able to keep going tremendously long times with a plan. The Navy was improving with every step of the way. Every defeat made it better, made it stronger, made them new tactics. There were new ways of building boats. All of these things were happening. And so gradually, or not so gradually, it began to accelerate very fast. They conquered down the Yangtze, they're beginning to conquer down the coastline. And then the general in charge was not Aju. The general in charge was a Mongol named Bayan. He was a very capable, wonderful person in history. He wasn't so much a military strategist as Aju was, but Kublai liked him. Kublai Khan often played, just as he played one religion against another, he would often play one general against another.
Mm.
And Aju had actually grown up in the Middle East, and he had been sent there from their cousins. So he was a very sophisticated, cosmopolitan person, and he brought great color to the court. Later, Marco Polo would be that kind of a person, where you're young and sophisticated from just because they knew some other place. Well, Bayan had been appointed head of the military, and it was a blow for Aju, whose father and grandfather had been the head of the military for so long. But Aju accepted it. Aju was so faithful to the mission, so loyal, and he and Bayan actually worked together very well. They refused to be rivals to each other. They
Mm.
cooperated, and Bayan recognized the superior talents of Aju. So together, they had worked down the Yangtze River, conquering city after city, and then finally in 1279 they came to Hangzhou, the capital of the Southern Song. The Southern Song had a bunch of emperors, some of whom may have been imbeciles, others of which were spending their time on boats with musicians and beautiful women floating around in the lake instead of building new boats to defend a country. They thought they were safe behind their great wall of the sea. And their tactic was a very simple one, that, okay, we're going to build a great wall of ships. That means we build all the ships, and then when the people attack, we chain them together in a great wall. Okay, they've lost all mobility. That tactic did not work. The Mongols figured out how to dart in and out and how to break the chain, how to do everything. And by 1279, they came in, they were ready to take Hangzhou. At that time, the emperor was a child, and the ruling power was a dowager empress named Xie. Xie is very controversial in the history, but I would just say I like her. I respect her. She's often called Ugly Xie because she was supposedly not attractive. She only had one eye. She had never been loved by her husband, the emperor, but she tolerated and she loved all of his wives. She took care of them. She was a very talented woman and she knew how to use the court. Xie's generals, one by one, were deserting. They were running away. Most of them left their own families right there in Hangzhou, and they would escape on the boats going farther south. She recognized that all the main cities had been taken, that there was nothing left they could do, and if they fought the Mongols, she knew the Mongol strategy. If you surrendered, they would guarantee your safety. That was a law from the time of Genghis Khan. If you fought against them, they would kill you. It's just like that. And she said there was no need for the people of Hangzhou to die for something that the generals would not defend. And so she tried to negotiate with Bayan to surrender. And over he said, no, we just surrender. She wanted to keep the emperor as a puppet or let him be a king. And they said, no, you surrender totally. That's only unconditional surrender. That's all we accept. And finally, she accepted unconditional surrender. She said she would. So Bayan came with a small detachment to the city, to the capital, and they entered to go look around the city and inspect what they had conquered. She was still in the palace with the emperor and the court, and she said word that she would like to surrender to him. And he said, he was sort of overly modest, fakely modest, and saying, well, I don't know the protocols of the palace and I don't know the protocols of the Chinese court, and I should not come to that. You should come to the Mongol camp to surrender. What he wanted, of course, was the soldiers had fought for this victory, and they deserved to see the surrender. He was not going to harm her or the child emperor, but they deserved to see the surrender. And so it was orchestrated in that way. Xie came out with the child emperor. They went to the Mongol camp. They surrendered before the Mongol soldiers. They bowed down towards Beijing, which was where Kublai Khan was ruling, and they accepted it. For that, she's often called a traitor, that she ended the great Song dynasty, and it was great, there's no denying that. The men had not defended it. The generals had lost the war. The navy had run away. But it's an old, ugly, one-eyed woman who's going to take the blame for 300 years of history. No. Xie saved the life not only of the young child emperor, whom she took with her to Beijing. Well, actually, they went separately. He went first, and then she came. But she had saved his life, but she saved the whole city. Now, the city would, of course, be, we would say, looted, but it would be looted in a very organized, systematic way of records being kept and the things mostly from the palace. It's not that the homes were being looted, but the palace, all the records, all the art, everything from the Song dynasty would be taken north to Beijing. But Xie was given a palace. The young prince was given a palace. The emperor, he's now a prince. They gave him a title of prince, Wang, and she retained the title, and so they lived on for many years. She died in Beijing, and his fate much later in life was going to be different. But they were received with hospitality, but they were also, you could say, an exhibit of the new Mongols. This is Kublai Khan's new Mongol world, and we don't treat the enemy the way that we treated the past. We don't kill them off. We bring them on and we let them have a nice life if they surrender. So the Song dynasty had officially ended, but there was still going to be opposition from those ships that had sailed away.
Yes. And before we get into that, like, there was also a moment that Kublai's wife started tearing up, right? When she saw the queen giving up, correct?
Yes. Well, this is what it said, that, of course, by tradition, all this stuff brought from the palace in Hangzhou, all this beautiful artwork from the centuries and all, that she would have the first choice of anything she wanted. Chabi was a very frugal woman. She was noted for always sewing and repairing things, and being very, even bowstrings. She would recycle the bowstrings after the war to use for the, So she wasn't a wild, extravagant, luxurious kind of woman, but she saw all this great wealth being brought up, and she said no, she would not take anything, because today it's a Song dynasty, but one day it will be the Mongols who lose. And so
she knew that's the course of history.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, she knew that's always the course of history. All empires fall eventually.
Yes.
And what happened afterwards with what you just told me, like the court, like a few important members of the court, they were able to flee?
A lot of them fled. They had a bunch of ships. They took the ships. They fled towards the south. And then they had a couple of brothers from the emperor. So now he was a prisoner, as they called it. Oh, he was. He was a prisoner. The emperor and the Empress Xie, they were up in Beijing now. And so this renegade navy, they appointed one of the little brothers as the emperor. Then they're sailing around, and they're not finding a lot of support, in large part because in the south, the merchants had mostly been Muslim merchants. The Chinese were great at producing, but they had relied heavily on Muslim merchants for the transportation and for the ships. And the Muslim merchants also were quite aware that in Chinese society, merchants, like craftsmen, artisans, ranked rather low, but among the Mongols, they ranked extremely high. They were right there, well above Confucian scholars and people doing calligraphy and all of that. They were highly valued. And so the Muslim community in the south sided with the Mongols, and that effectively kept the ships from landing for very long and for making a base in the south. So they're floating around. Here's this navy with no country floating around. Well, I don't know what happened, but they somehow dropped the young emperor in the ocean. And it was a storm or something going on, or maybe he was thrown in. We don't know. But by the time they fished him out, he was almost dead, and he lived on for only another short time, a couple of days, and he died. So now they've got to find out. Well, they have one more brother. This is going to be the last little boy. He's not yet 7 years old, and so they go to land, and they have a big ceremony to make him the new emperor, and then they sail off, but they can't find refuge, so they're going to try to head towards northern Vietnam because a lot of other Song people had settled in Vietnam and found refuge there. But the Dai Viet of northern Vietnam, they were not anxious to have this exiled court come in. They really liked the Song. They sided with them in many ways, but they realized history had shifted. And what were they going to do? So fortunately for them, the fleet never made it there. They settled on a small island, not so far from what's now Hong Kong, there, and they set up a base, but with their nonsense way of thinking about things, the first thing they wanted to do was build a palace for the high official. Well, your navy without even a country, you found some island and you're going to build a palace? So they split their out resources and they built a palace. Well, it took a while for the Mongols to find them, but especially with all of these Muslim navigators, they were quickly located. So the Mongols, they had to assemble another fleet. It took a little while to get there, a few months, and they went there. And so the Southern Song renegades who were there, they decided to defend it in the typical Southern Song way. They chain all their boats together across the harbor. And then in the middle, they build a palace boat. And they take the little emperor out there. He's now just had his 7th birthday. And they take him out there. This is in 1279. And they take him out and they put him on a boat. And this poor child, he just has one friend in the world. That's a parrot. He's there with his little parrot pet. And he's in the middle of this war that's about to break out. And the people around him, they've deserted the land. They've gone to the ships. So what do the Mongols do? They immediately send their troops onto the land. They take over the land. Well, the land is higher than the ships. So now they occupy the high land around, and now they can just fire down onto the ships. And the ships are chained together. They can't get away. And they can't get firewood, and they can't get water. So soon the men are having to drink the seawater. They're having to eat rice that hasn't been cooked because they have no fire to cook it. They're in terrible shape. They're dying from dysentery and various diseases. And they're going to lose. And the Mongols repeatedly ask the former Song officials to surrender. Please surrender. We will guarantee it. We've done this with the other brother. We will guarantee everyone's safety and all. But the prime minister, of course, is arrogant, and he's not going to surrender. And he considers the Dowager Empress Xie to be a traitor to the country. And the child emperor, the other child, he's only a child. How could he be a traitor to the country? He's considered that. So they're fighting, and the Southern Song army is, of course, losing because it's all on ships. There's nothing it could do on ships that are being fired upon. They're chained together. And even when some of the Song people try to rescue the little emperor, the minister won't allow it. He won't allow that. He's afraid that they will rescue him and then perhaps sell him to the Mongols or give him to the Mongols or do something. And so first, the prime minister throws his wife and his own family into the sea to drown. Then he takes the child and holds it in his arms, and he jumps into the sea with them. And in the confusion, the parrot cage came loose and fell into the sea. 300 years of one of the greatest civilizations or the greatest dynasties in history ended in an act of murder, the assassination of a child who is exactly 7 years and 1 month old. This child and his parrot, the child emperor and the parrot, die in the waters. That's the end of the glorious Song dynasty. Finished.